The blizzard, slamming into Pine Kettle Ridge, didn't just bring cold. It brought a death sentence. The wind howled like a starving beast, lashing razor-sharp shards of ice across the pale face of Tobias Reed, a 27-year-old carpenter weathered by years of hard winters and seasonal labor. He leaned into the storm, one hand shielding his eyes while the other gripped the rope tied to his dog's collar. Tobias staggered, his frostbitten legs finally giving out near a cluster of broken pines. He was almost ready to give in, to let the snow bury him like a white grave. But then Brindle suddenly bolted toward a nearby slope. The dog wasn't looking for shelter. He stood his ground, front paws clawing furiously at what looked like an ordinary patch of earth, barking in sharp, relentless bursts that tore through the storm. "Brindle, get back here!" Tobias rasped, his breath blooming into a thick white mist. The dog didn't listen. He barked louder, nose pressed against a faint fissure hidden beneath the deep snow. Amid the screaming wind, Tobias froze. He heard something that didn't belong to the storm. A hollow, eerie rush of air being pulled down into the earth through a hidden passage. With the last of his strength, Tobias crawled toward the dog. As he knelt and pressed his bruised, trembling hand toward the crack, a draft not as freezing as the air above brushed against his skin. That was when he realized this hill wasn't solid ground. Something beneath the snow was breathing. Is there a life-saving shelter beneath that deep snow? Or is it the beginning of a nightmare? Don't let Tobias and Brindle face the storm alone. Hit like and subscribe to warm up their journey of survival. Only a few hours earlier, Tobias Reed had still been standing inside the farmhouse he spent half his life keeping upright. Tobias Reed buried his father 3 weeks before the first blizzard reached Pine Kettle Ridge. The old man had survived logging accidents, broken ribs, river crossings, and 30 years of Wyoming winters. What finally killed him was a lung fever caught during late autumn repairs on the north barn roof. After the funeral, the farm changed quickly, too quickly. Marla Reed, Tobias's stepmother, took control of the land papers before the ground above the grave had fully frozen. Within days, she sold part of the cattle herd and began speaking openly about spring buyers for the South Field and timber rights near Black Timber Creek. Tobias listened quietly while repairing fences, stacking cedar, and sealing gaps around the livestock shed before winter arrived. For nearly 12 years, he had kept the property functioning. He replaced roof beams after storms, dug drainage trenches every thaw season, cut and stacked almost every cord of winter firewood behind the house. But none of that belonged to him. One evening, Marla finally placed the truth plainly on the kitchen table beside the signed widow's documents. "You got no claim here," she said. "Your father never put your name on anything. In hard country, ownership mattered more than memory." Marla handed him a sack of cornmeal, a few strips of salt pork, and one old wool blanket. That was his share. Brindle stood beside Tobias with the fur along his neck raised low, while snow tapped softly against the window glass. Tobias himself had repaired the winter before. An hour later, Tobias stepped off the porch into the cold. Then the bolt locked behind him. Black Hollow sat more than 14 miles south of the Reed farm. In good weather, a man with a wagon could reach it before sunset. This was not good weather. Snow thickened faster than Tobias expected. Wind rolled hard across the open fields and cut through his coat seams like cold wire. Every breath scraped his lungs on the way in. Brindle kept glancing toward the western hills instead of following the road. That bothered Tobias. Dogs noticed changes before storms fully arrived. Old trappers trusted that more than they trusted the sky. After the first mile, Tobias felt water beginning to seep through his boots. By the second, 2 of his toes had already gone numb. His pace slowed without permission from the rest of him. That was how winter usually started killing people. Not all at once. Slowly, quietly, by taking speed first. Tobias did not panic. He knew hunger took time, cold did not. And wet boots in mountain snow could bury a man faster than an empty stomach ever would. He stopped once and looked back toward the farm. The house was already gone behind the white curtain moving across the valley. Another half-mile passed before Brindle stopped obeying the road entirely. The old dog pulled hard against the rope and let out a low growl toward the western hills. Snow gathered thick along his back, while he strained toward a dark stretch of limestone ridge beyond the fields. Tobias tightened his grip. "Wrong way," he muttered. Brindle pulled again. Harder this time. At first Tobias thought the animal was frightened by the storm. Then he noticed something important. The wind shifted near the hills. Out across the open ground, the gusts struck clean and brutal. But near the limestone ridge, the pine growth interrupted the flow. Snow moved differently there. Lower, broken apart. Less exposed. Natural windbreak. That mattered. A man could survive cold longer than wind. Brindle barked once and tugged again toward the trees. Tobias studied the ridge another moment, then finally nodded to himself. Staying on the road no longer meant safety. It only meant dying in a straighter line. So he stepped off the last visible wagon trail and followed the dog toward the dark pines and the snow-covered hills beyond them. Climbing the ridge drained Tobias faster than he expected. Snow hid loose stone beneath every step. His legs began to feel heavy. Not sore, heavy, like iron tied below the knees. His fingers lost sensation one at a time, inside wet gloves, and even simple thoughts started arriving slower than they should. That frightened him. Cold did not always kill through pain. Sometimes it killed through comfort. Ahead stood a large pine, bent sideways by years of mountain wind. The trunk blocked enough snow to form a shallow pocket beneath the branches. Shelter. Just for a few minutes. Tobias stared at it too long. Brindle exploded into sharp barking and suddenly bit the sleeve of Tobias's coat, pulling backward hard enough to nearly twist the fabric. The dog understood first. Men who sat down in storms like this often stopped standing again. Tobias closed his eyes once, forced air into aching lungs, then pushed himself upright and kept climbing into the darkening snow. Brindle suddenly surged ahead through the drifts and disappeared behind a mound near the limestone slope. Then came the barking again. Fast, aggressive, almost desperate. Tobias forced himself uphill toward the sound while snow whipped across his face hard enough to sting. By the time he reached the dog, Brindle was already digging furiously into a patch of packed snow beside the hill. At first, Tobias saw nothing unusual. Then he heard it. A low, hollow sound beneath the wind. Not the sound of air moving across open ground. This came from underneath. A narrow pull. A faint rushing hiss somewhere below the drift. Tobias dropped beside the dog and clawed snow away with numb hands. A strip of black wood emerged first. Then old iron nails. Then something even stranger. A straight edge. Nature rarely made straight lines in mountain stone. Tobias brushed away more snow and uncovered part of a heavy timber surface buried directly into the hillside. The surrounding ground looked wrong now that he noticed properly. Too smooth, too shaped. Someone had built something here. Brindle kept scratching at the lower edge while Tobias pressed his glove against the exposed wood. It was cold, but not as cold as the frozen rocks surrounding it. Tobias cleared more snow away until the full shape finally appeared. A door, heavy timber. Iron straps darkened with age, half buried directly into the hillside. He stared at it while wind hammered the ridge behind him. The thing could have been anything. An old root cellar, a collapsed supply cache, an animal den, even a frozen grave dug into the hill years earlier and forgotten by everyone still alive. Brindle pressed close against Tobias's leg and let out a quiet whine. The storm was worsening fast. That decided the matter. Tobias grabbed the iron handle and pulled hard. At first, nothing moved. Then the hinges groaned. The door opened several inches, and a slow breath of air drifted outward into the storm. Not warm, but dry. Still. Without wind, Tobias immediately felt the difference. He shoved the opening wider, pulled Brindle inside, and slammed the heavy door shut behind them. The roar of the blizzard vanished almost completely. Darkness swallowed the passage until Tobias struck a match with shaking fingers. The small flame revealed stone steps descending into the hill. Cedar support beams lined the narrow passageway. Packed earth walls rose on both sides, dry despite the storm raging outside. The tunnel extended deeper underground than Tobias expected, disappearing beyond the weak orange glow of the match. Brindle moved ahead first, but the dog did not growl, did not hesitate. That mattered. Animals sensed danger faster than men buried it beneath reason. Tobias followed carefully down the steps, while the smell of dry earth and old wood slowly replaced the smell of snow and wind. Then the tunnel widened suddenly into a chamber far larger than any storm shelter had a right to be. The chamber beneath the hill looked less like a hiding place and more like preparation made solid. Shelves covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Thick, wooden shelves, hand-built and reinforced against weight. Every row held food. Glass jars filled with preserved beans and carrots. Strips of salt pork hanging from iron hooks overhead. Barrels of rye sealed with waxed cloth. Potatoes packed carefully in ash to slow freezing. Dried apples tied in bundles near the ceiling beams. Navy beans stored inside heavy canvas sacks, coated against moisture. Nothing had been thrown here in panic. Everything had been measured, placed, protected. At the center of the chamber stood a small cast-iron stove connected to a stovepipe that disappeared into the stone above. Behind it rose a thick limestone wall, darkened slightly by years of stored heat. Beside the stove sat neatly stacked cedar firewood covered beneath oil-treated canvas, dry wood. That alone nearly stunned Tobias. Outside, half the valley would already be fighting damp timber before winter fully arrived. Brindle crossed the room slowly, sniffed once near the stove, then lowered himself onto the packed earth floor with a tired groan. The dog had stopped trembling. Tobias moved deeper into the chamber with the caution of a man entering a church abandoned by time. The shelter smelled faintly of dry soil, old smoke, cedar oil, and preserved food. Human smells, built smells. Someone had fought winter here before, and fought it seriously. Tobias picked up one sealed jar and turned it slowly near the weak matchlight. No frost inside, no spoilage, no cracked glass. Then he looked back across the shelves again, and finally understood the scale of what stood beneath the hill. This was not a temporary refuge. Whoever built this place had prepared to survive an entire winter underground if necessary. Tobias forced himself to think in order. Shelter first, fire second, emotion later. That was how men stayed alive once winter cornered them. He knelt beside the cast-iron stove and inspected it carefully before touching the wood pile. Old ash still rested inside the firebox. Dry ash, good sign. He checked the stovepipe connection next, then looked upward toward the dark ceiling where the exhaust shaft disappeared into the hill. No obvious collapse, no heavy moisture, still usable. Beside the stove sat split cedar kindling stacked beneath oil canvas, protected from dampness with almost obsessive care. Tobias fed a few pieces into the stove, struck a match, and waited. The fire caught quickly. For a moment, everything worked perfectly. Smoke pulled upward through the pipe exactly the way it should. Then, the draft suddenly failed. A thick wave of smoke rolled back into the chamber ceiling and spread across the room in dark layers. Brindle jumped to his feet immediately and growled toward the upper shaft. Tobias reacted fast. Not panic. Movement. He grabbed the lantern, climbed onto a storage crate, and held the light upward near the ceiling vent. Snowmelt dripped slowly from one side of the shaft opening. Blocked airflow. Partially sealed by drifting snow outside. Tobias found an iron rod hanging near the wall and shoved it upward into the narrow vent passage. Ice cracked loose somewhere overhead. Snow shifted. Cold air suddenly rushed downward through the intake, with enough force to flicker the lantern flame sideways. Then the stove changed sound. The draft caught again. Smoke pulled hard into the pipe and vanished upward where it belonged. A few minutes later, Steady heat began spreading slowly across the packed earth floor and limestone wall behind the stove. Not dramatic warmth, not comfort, but the kind of controlled heat built by someone who understood exactly how winter killed careless men. Only after the fire settled into a steady burn did Tobias finally remove his boots. Steam rose slowly from the soaked leather as he set them near the stove. His feet ached hard enough to pulse beneath the skin, while warmth gradually returned to his toes in sharp, painful waves. Across the chamber, Brindle had already curled himself against the limestone wall behind the stove. The dog was asleep within minutes, breathing slowly for the first time since leaving the farm. Tobias opened one of the sealed jars from the shelf. Navy beans, then a hard piece of rye bread, and a strip of smoked salt pork. Simple food, ordinary food. But winter changed the value of ordinary things. Only people who had come close to freezing understood how precious unfrozen food could become. Tobias ate slowly while studying the shelter around him. No frost lined the walls. No dampness gathered near the ceiling. The air remained dry despite the storm above them, and even the packed earth floor felt stable beneath his boots instead of frozen solid. That mattered. Large heat could fade quickly. Stable heat lasted. Whoever built this place understood the difference. Tobias looked once more toward the shelves of preserved food and finally allowed himself a thought he had avoided since the storm began. He might actually survive the night beneath this hill. Tobias woke to silence. Not empty silence, protected silence. The kind that only existed when several feet of earth, stone, and packed snow stood between a man and the storm, trying to bury him alive. For a few moments, he simply lay there listening. No wind pushing through cracks, no loose boards rattling, no ice forming along walls, only the faint ticking sound of cooling iron from the stove. That alone told him something important. The shelter had held heat through the night. Tobias pushed himself upright and checked the chamber carefully before adding more wood to the fire. A thin layer of ice floated across the water bucket near the wall, but the bucket itself had not frozen solid. The potatoes stored in ash remained firm instead of rock hard. Even the old coals beneath the stove grate still carried trapped warmth. Slow warmth, steady warmth. That was the secret. Air changed fast. Earth did not. Cabins standing above ground fought winter from every direction at once. Wind struck their walls all night long. Cold crept through boards, gaps, nails, corners. But down here, the hill itself absorbed change, slowly. Tobias placed one hand against the limestone behind the stove and felt faint heat still resting inside the stone from the night before. Someone had built this shelter to work with winter instead of against it. Later that morning, Tobias began inspecting the deeper sections of the shelter properly. The farther he moved into the hill, the more deliberate the entire structure became. Nothing underground had been built carelessly. A narrow drainage trench ran along the lower edge of the rear storage chamber to carry moisture away before it could collect beneath the floor. Large barrels rested on limestone blocks instead of directly on dirt, protecting grain from ground dampness. Near the ceiling, Tobias discovered a second ventilation opening hidden behind hanging canvas, smaller than the main shaft but carefully positioned to keep air circulating through the deeper rooms. The shelter was not merely hidden. It had been studied, improved, refined by experience. Near the back wall, beneath a stack of folded oilcloth, Tobias found an old ledger wrapped in weathered canvas. The cover read only one name: Silas Bracken. Tobias sat near the stove and carefully opened it. Most of the pages contained practical records written in thick carpenter's pencil. Wood burned per day. Outside temperatures. Snow depth measurements. Notes on which foods lasted longest underground and which spoiled fastest once condensation formed. There were sketches, too. Airflow directions, vent placement, draft corrections. Not the work of an inventor chasing cleverness. The work of a man trying not to freeze again. Tobias turned another page, slowly, and stopped reading for a moment. One line had been pressed harder into the paper than the others. Cabins lose heat because winter touches every wall. The deeper Tobias read into the ledger, the clearer Silas Bracken became. Not a miner, not a hermit. A freight station keeper from the northern passes above Pine Kettle Ridge during the winter of 1873, the season later remembered by survivors as the Blue Starve Winter. Silas wrote about it plainly. That made the pages worse. No dramatic language, no self-pity, only facts. Storage sheds above ground turned damp after repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Flour sacks absorbed moisture and hardened into useless blocks. Salt pork froze solid, then spoiled once warmer air returned briefly through the cabins. Wind pushed through wall seams every night, no matter how much moss or cloth men stuffed between the boards. And always the cold. Constant. Patient. Silas lost his younger brother that winter after a supply run failed to return through the passes. 2 draft horses froze standing in harness. By February, most of the men keeping the station alive had either abandoned it or died trying to reach lower ground. One entry stopped Tobias completely. Built walls higher, lost heat faster. After that winter, Silas stopped trying to fight the mountains above ground. He started digging downward instead. The shelter beneath the hill had not been built for comfort. It had been built to reduce exposure. Fewer walls for wind to touch. Less roof for snow to crush. More earth holding steady against sudden cold. The final lines on the page were darker than the rest, as if written under heavier pressure. The earth keeps what it covers better than men do. Tobias sat quietly beside the stove for a long time after reading that sentence, while the storm continued moving across the world above him. 2 days passed before Tobias opened the shelter door again. Even then, he only cracked it several inches at first. Wind immediately slammed snow through the opening hard enough to scatter loose powder across the tunnel floor. The storm outside had grown worse, not weaker. Tobias forced the door wider and climbed halfway up the buried entrance. The world beyond the hill had disappeared. Fence lines were gone beneath drifting snow. Pine trees stood as vague, dark shapes inside the whiteout before vanishing entirely a few yards farther out. Wind swept across the ridge in long horizontal blasts that looked more like sandstorms than snowfall. No wagon could travel through this. No rider either. A man caught outside without shelter would not survive long enough to see morning. Tobias shut the door quickly and descended back underground while snow still hissed against the timber above him. The difference struck him harder this time. Below the hill, the chamber remained dry. The stove still held stable heat. The cedar wood burned clean, and the food stores remained unfrozen. Nothing down there reacted quickly. That was the advantage. Surface cabins fought every change in weather the moment it arrived. Wind hit their walls instantly. Cold entered immediately. Heat escaped constantly. But underground, the earth slowed everything. Cold moved slower. Moisture moved slower. Loss moved slower. Tobias stood for a moment beside the closed shelter door and looked back toward the warm chamber, glowing deeper inside the hill. Then he finally understood something with complete clarity. Without this place, the mountain would have killed him the very first night. By the 4th day underground, Tobias noticed the shelter changing, only slightly at first. A thin bead of moisture gathered along one ceiling beam near the rear storage alcove. Later that evening, Brindle lifted his head from beside the stove and stared toward the same corner while a single drop of water tapped softly onto the dirt floor. Tobias checked the grain barrels immediately. 2 of the canvas sacks felt colder than before. Dampness had started creeping into the outer layer of one rye bag. Not much, but enough. He remembered a line from Silas Bracken's ledger almost at once. Warmth without airflow rots a shelter from inside. That was the danger men missed underground. Too much cold killed quickly. Too much trapped warmth killed slowly. Tobias spent the next several hours correcting the problem before it spread further. He reopened part of the drainage trench along the rear wall, where packed dirt had started collapsing inward. He shifted the grain barrels farther from the warm stone behind the stove. That night, he allowed the fire to burn lower instead of feeding it constantly. Then he climbed onto the storage crates again and widened the lower intake shaft several more inches with the iron rod. Cold air immediately moved differently through the chamber. Not stronger, cleaner. The shelter breathed again. By morning, the condensation along the ceiling beam had disappeared completely. The grain sacks remained dry, the walls stayed clear of frost, and the air inside the chamber no longer felt heavy with trapped heat. The place still worked, but only because someone living inside it understood why it worked. The knocking came late on the 5th night. Weak, uneven. At first, Tobias thought the storm was throwing loose branches against the buried door. Then the sound came again. 3 slow impacts beneath the wind overhead. Brindle was already awake. The dog stood near the entrance tunnel with his ears forward and a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Tobias grabbed the lantern and climbed the stairs carefully. Cold air leaked through the cracks around the doorframe as he lifted the heavy timber bar aside. The storm nearly ripped the door from his hand when he opened it. Outside stood Mrs. Elowen Pike, a widowed seamstress from Black Hollow, bent sideways against the wind, with one arm wrapped tightly around her granddaughter Clara. The little girl could barely stand. Snow coated both of them almost completely. "We saw smoke," Mrs. Pike whispered through cracked lips. "Thought maybe. Hunters." Clara's gloves were stiff with ice. Her jaw shook so violently she could not speak. Tobias pulled them inside immediately and forced the door shut behind them. The difference hit the 2 newcomers all at once. Not hot warmth, living warmth, the kind that allowed muscles to unclench slowly instead of freezing solid. Brindle approached Clara first. The old dog pressed himself quietly against the girl's legs, while Tobias guided them deeper into the chamber near the stove. Mrs. Pike stared around the shelter in disbelief. The shelves of preserved food, the dry walls, the steady fire, the heat trapped inside stone and earth instead of fighting uselessly against the wind. "What is this place?" she asked softly. Tobias shook his head once, while helping Clara remove her frozen gloves. "I think somebody built it for winters exactly like this." The child's hands were pale and stiff at first. Tobias wrapped them carefully in warm cloth near the stove, while Mrs. Pike sat beside her, trembling from exhaustion more than cold. Minutes passed. Then Clara's shaking finally began slowing. Not suddenly, gradually, like life returning one careful piece at a time. Mrs. Pike lowered her face into both hands and started crying quietly the moment she realized the girl could feel her fingers again. By the 6th day, word had begun spreading through Black Hollow despite the storm. People talked about smoke rising from the western ridge, about a place beneath the hill where water did not freeze solid and wind could not reach the walls. Then more knocking started. A trapper with frostbitten ears arrived before dawn carrying half-wet blankets over his shoulders. Later came a husband and wife from the lower creek cabins after their stovepipe collapsed beneath drifting snow. Another family followed after losing most of their flour when moisture seeped into their storage shed and turned the sacks into heavy gray paste. The valley was losing ground to winter faster than anyone expected. Cabins above the ridge leaked heat constantly. Green woods smoked without burning properly. Frozen wells forced families to melt dirty snow indoors. Every time a door opened, warmth escaped immediately into the storm. Underground, the shelter behaved differently. Not perfect, controlled. That difference mattered. Tobias understood quickly that survival down there depended on discipline more than luck. Panic could ruin the place as easily as cold. So he organized everything. Sleeping areas were separated along the outer walls where body heat stayed more stable through the night. Wet coats were kept near the entrance tunnel instead of the food shelves. The stove fire was fed in smaller intervals instead of massive burns that overheated the chamber and created condensation. Every morning Tobias inspected the ventilation shafts himself. Every evening he checked the drainage trench. Cedar wood was stacked by dryness, not size. The driest pieces stayed closest to the stove, while the newer wood remained farther back near the cooler walls. Food was rationed evenly no matter who arrived with supplies and who arrived empty-handed. Nothing underground happened by accident anymore. And slowly, people began noticing the difference between this place and the world above it. Lantern light reflected warmly off packed earth walls instead of frost. Breath no longer turned white inside the chamber. Even the sound of the storm felt distant now, muted beneath stone and snow. One older ranch hand stood beside the limestone wall, late one night with both palms pressed against the stone behind the stove. He shook his head once in disbelief. "It's warmer down here than my own house." Nobody argued with him, because outside, winter was still stripping heat from every exposed wall in Black Hollow. But beneath the hill, the shelter kept holding its ground. Deputy Nolan Price arrived during the 8th night of the storm. The man looked older than Tobias remembered. Snow coated his hat and shoulders in thick layers, and one side of his coat hung torn, where the wind had ripped a cabin shutter loose and thrown it across his porch. Behind him stood 2 exhausted horses with ice frozen into their manes. Nolan had spent most of the week riding between cabins across Black Hollow, trying to keep people alive. Now, even his own place was failing. The front door of his cabin no longer sealed properly after the hinges split in the cold. Most of his dry cedar had already been burned. Worse still, his wife had started coughing blood after 3 straight nights sleeping in freezing drafts. When Tobias opened the shelter door, Nolan stared at the buried entrance with open disbelief. "So this is the place everybody's talking about," he muttered. "A hole dug into a hill," Tobias answered calmly. "A hole staying warmer than most houses right now." Nolan gave a tired snort and stepped inside. The reaction came slowly. First, he noticed the lack of wind, then the warmth. Not powerful heat, not furnace heat, something stranger than that. Stable warmth, quiet warmth, the kind that stayed instead of escaping every time the storm shifted outside. As Tobias led him deeper underground, Nolan's expression changed further. The food shelves remained dry. Water buckets still held liquid beneath thin ice instead of freezing solid. The air carried no smell of mold or trapped smoke. Most of all, the walls themselves felt alive with stored heat. Nolan stopped beside the limestone backing behind the stove and pressed one rough hand against the stone. Firelight flickered softly across the packed earth walls, while people slept beneath blankets nearby without shivering. No one spoke for several seconds. The deputy simply stood there, feeling the warmth held inside the hill itself. Then he looked slowly around the chamber once more. The ventilation shafts, the dry cedar, the protected storage, the reduced space needing heat. The old logic of the place revealed itself piece by piece. Finally, Nolan exhaled quietly through his nose and shook his head. "This hill keeps heat better than any cabin I've ever stood in." It was not admiration in his voice. It was surrender to evidence. Tobias said nothing. He only added another piece of cedar to the stove and checked the airflow draft the same way he had every night before. Nolan watched him for a long moment after that. Then his eyes lowered briefly toward the glowing limestone wall. "Your father would have understood this place," he said quietly. And for the first time since leaving the farm, Tobias did not answer immediately. The storm finally loosened its grip near the end of February. Not all at once. The wind simply weakened one morning and failed to return with the same violence by nightfall. A few days later, pale sunlight reached parts of the valley floor for the first time in weeks. When people emerged fully from their cabins again, Black Hollow looked exhausted. Fence lines lay flattened beneath frozen drifts. Several livestock sheds had partially collapsed under snow weight. Entire stacks of firewood had been burned down to almost nothing. Nearly half the valley's flour stores were ruined by dampness and repeated freezing. Some cabins stood empty. A few families had abandoned them during the worst nights and never returned. Winter had touched every structure above ground eventually. Every wall, every roof, every exposed corner. But beneath the limestone ridge west of town, the shelter remained almost unchanged. The food stores were lower now, but still protected. The drainage trench still carried moisture away from the floor. The limestone behind the stove still released slow heat long after the fire settled each night. Most important of all, the place had continued functioning because somebody understood how to maintain it. Not perfectly, correctly. That difference stayed with the people of Black Hollow long after the storm passed. Spring came slowly to the mountains that year. Snowmelt crept down the hillsides in narrow silver streams, while men rebuilt fences and repaired warped cabin walls. Yet something else changed too. People began digging deeper root cellars beside their homes. Barrels were no longer placed directly on dirt floors but raised carefully on stone blocks. Ventilation shafts appeared in new storage sheds across the valley. Families stopped relying only on bigger fires and thicker walls. They started thinking about airflow, dryness, stable temperature, reduced exposure. The old assumptions had failed them. The hill had proven something else worked better. Tobias never became a hero in Black Hollow. That was not the kind of place frontier towns usually produced. No speeches were given, no celebrations followed him through the streets. Most people simply returned to work, once survival no longer demanded immediate attention. But they listened now when Tobias spoke about winter preparation, and they watched how he stacked wood, how he vented storage rooms, how he positioned food away from moisture. Because the mountain had tested every idea that winter, only a few survived intact. One evening near the start of thaw season, Tobias stood outside the buried shelter entrance while water dripped steadily from the pine branches overhead. Brindle rested nearby with his head across his paws, older now, but still watching the ridgeline the way working dogs always did. Smoke rose quietly from the hidden vent above the hill, thin, controlled, alive. Below the ground behind Tobias, warmth still rested inside stone and earth, exactly where Silas Bracken had intended it to remain all those years before. The valley would remember that winter for a long time, not because the storm had been cruel, but because it had been honest. Winter had touched every cabin in Black Hollow, but the hill had decided to protect what was buried beneath it. And after hearing Tobias Reed's story, do you think you would have followed the road to town like everyone else? Or trusted the dog barking at the hill?